Hi, so I'm going to be talking to you about assessing the status of UK earthworms today. So it's a project that I'm working on behalf of Natural England, and it borrows heavily from the idea, the concepts behind the IUCN Red Listing. But I do need to have a caveat right at the beginning that this is not red listing. It doesn't follow the same statistical rigor, and I'll come to that later in the talk. So I want to start by going back to, oh, bear with me one sec. I want to start by going back to the year 2012, not 2012, 2012, and a research project that was undertaken by Dan Carpenter and other earthworm researchers that looked at the current status of earthworm records and our knowledge of distributions and populations of earthworms within the UK. So it was published back in 2012, but I believe that the research took place around 2009. And they contacted other research organisations, local environmental record centres, and tried to gather as many earthworm species occurrence records as they could to see what we knew about earthworms across the British Isles. So that included the UK countries and Ireland. And like I said, nearly 4,000 records were gathered. You'll see from the list on that slide that they're all from research organisations or government agencies that undertake research. So, and some of them are mined from actual research papers. They didn't get any responses from local environmental record centres with additional data. And one of the reasons for that is most likely because a lot of record centres didn't have any or very many earthworm records. There was no formal earthworm recording scheme, so there was no equivalent of the likes of Botanical Site of Britain and Ireland or the butterfly conservation recording schemes for moths and butterflies or anything like that. And they mapped our earthworms, and it was the first time that I'm aware of, at least, that earthworms were ever mapped within the UK. And I should say that that 4,000, nearly 4,000 records covers all species of earthworms. So when they're mapped, as you can see on this distribution map here, we can see that we're not covering the whole of the UK. There is UK there. That tells us that there's huge gaps in the data because we do know that earthworms pretty much occur all over the UK. So when we looked at some individual species, Aparectidia caliginosa is a widespread species that is known to have very little habitat specificity. You basically get it anywhere, even in really disturbed soils, you'll get it in really high numbers. We can see that that distribution map there pretty much mirrors the map of all species. So the gaps there are more likely to be to do with under recording than they are to be with gaps in the actual distribution. And really interesting, when we look at another really common and widespread species, IUCN Red, we see a different picture. Now, just looking at those two maps, you could maybe infer that IUCN Red is much more rare than Aparectidia caliginosa. You could maybe estimate that it's got more of a southern distribution across the British Isles than Aparectidia caliginosa, but that would be incorrect. What these maps are actually showing us is that the data has some really strong biases towards the surveying of soils, because IUCN Red is rarely found in the soil. It's usually found in compost bins, in dung and things like that, whereas Aparectidia caliginosa is commonly found in the soil. And most of the data that was used in this research paper actually was resulting from soil surveys, because that's what most research data does. It looks at soils, predominantly in agricultural soils, sometimes in woodland, and much less so across other habitats. But it doesn't really take data very often from other microhabitats like deadwood, compost, dung, etc. So this research paper was really fundamental in the UK for getting other things going. So the Earthworm Society of Britain was founded as a result, and Natural England used this data to commission a report called Earthworms in England, and that was undertaken by Dr. David Jones, also at the Natural History Museum. And Dr. Jones looked at earthworms across the UK, gathered extra additional data by going out and doing surveying, and got the number of species occurrence records that were analysed up to 6,309. Now, what we, I believe that this was just Great Britain, but I might be wrong. I think it was. Added 56 sites from England and consolidated existing data. So we've got more data here for a smaller geographic region as well. And one of the things that David did was he did this graph where he looked at the number of the ranked abundance of the earthworms. And we can see here that Allelobophola chlorotica makes up for over a third of all earthworms in the UK. So for those that don't know, chlorotica is a small earthworm that comes in a green and a pink form. Each are thought to have different ecological preferences as well. Most likely actually a number of different species. But this earthworm was by far the most common, and it accounted for over a third. And I'll come back to this later, because again, we've probably got a bias here relating to the research data. So, but this is the data that we've got. So when we, as part of this report, David gave each species of earthworm a rarity value based on a number of criteria. These weren't anywhere near as strict as using the conservation statuses in IUCN Red Listing. But we've got a list of common species there, rare species, and extremely rare species. And these extremely rare species were the species that Natural England would then prioritise for a further project where they went out and got more survey data. There was a number of species that would not assess for various reasons. So Microscolix, Phosphorius, and Sparganophilus tomesis are non-native species that originate from outside of the UK. They're from families that are traditionally found in South and North America, respectively. Aparectidae nocturna is a species that has been split from Aparectidae caliginosa since this report was written. And Caelinus armidus is a species that was then described following this report from Ireland, and it since then has been found in the UK as well. So it gave us a starting point, but there are known biases and limitations of that data. So moving on from there, in 2014, I got involved with the Earthworm Society of Britain and formally launched the National Earthworm Recording Scheme. So this finally gave a pathway for biological recorders to submit data, earthworm data, into a system through, for example, iRecord, through local environment record centres, etc., where the data would get scrutinised and verified. So we started building, in addition to the research data sets, biological recorder data sets. And in addition to actually just dealing with the data, Emma Sherlock produced a key to the earthworms of the UK and Ireland that was a bit more accessible than the previous ID literature. We started delivering training courses, we produced guidance, so we made it easier for people to ID and submit records of earthworms. Now, unfortunately, we still have a problem where earthworms can only be identified looking at them down a microscopic features. So there are still limitations to how many people are going to take part in earthworm recording because they're hard to ID. You do need to collect, kill, preserve, and look at down a microscope. But that has started generating new data. And as of 31st of December, we had 22,181 records across the British Isles. So that includes the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands, and Republic of Ireland. And we can see there the data that's come into the recording scheme. Now, I should add that this includes research data. So it includes some of the data from those previous projects. So not all data was compatible or verifiable, and not all data was transferred across. But this means that at the end of 2022, we had a data set of 22,000 records. So way more records than we've ever had before for analysis. And when we compared the data that was gathered through the recording scheme, which you'll see on the left of that diagram, with the data that was used in Natural England report, much of which is now also available to us, we can see that that ranked abundance looked quite different. So this tells us that what recorders are finding is not necessarily the same as what the research analysis of the research data is telling us. And there are a number of reasons for that, some of which I'll go into later, but the predominant one is that the data from recorders is really more varied than the data that comes in through research, because our recorders are looking in a lot more microhabitats. They're looking in habitats like parks and gardens, wetlands, so not just agriculture, and to a lesser extent, woodland. So we're starting to see differences in the data sets. So it's really time to do more assessment on the rarities. So, for example, Merchiona muldali was the 4th most commonly found species within the Natural England report. But when we look at our research data, recorder data, it's nowhere near that. And the reason for that is it's something that is quite often found in agricultural sites. What was really interesting as well is that some of these rarer earthworms that were not detected at all, or on very low numbers in the Natural England data, we were finding, and that's partly to do with targeted effort, but also to do with using a wider range of habitat and sampling protocol combinations. However, there still wasn't enough data really to do some kind of assessment. So to fill some of the gaps, before I did the assessment that I was doing, Natural England commissioned Kerry Calloway, another earthworm recorder, to do what we call the Earthworm Records Project. So Kerry was looking specifically for records relating to rare species. So we were aware, for example, that with Sparganophilus tomesis, we had no records in the scheme database, but we know that it's been found in the UK from museum specimens. So Kerry's role was to go and look at museum specimens, research papers and data sets, and specifically look through Hilderic Friend, who was a prevalent earthworm recorder and taxonomist in the early 20th century, to look at his records. So Kerry spent a few months going through these sources, going through the data, and trying to get data to the point where it could be submitted into the Earthworm Recording Scheme database. So examples of this are there'd be museum specimens that would just have England written on them. Kerry would look for research papers relating to that, see if she could get more data. She might also go and look at the original specimen labels and see if they had more context. And through that, Kerry was able to get an extra 2,714 records. Where this was really valuable was Kerry was able to add more Welsh and Scottish data and Northern Irish data where those were lacking. Really usefully, though, when we look at the species that are considered rare in the original Natural England report, we can see the existing records in orange there, and the new records that Kerry added in green. For some species, this was really, really significant. So Dendrobina veneta is actually probably a more common species than the original report allowed for. Kerry added 25, so she added almost a third of the records again, just through looking at historic records. For Helodrillus oculatus, which is a relatively rare species that specializes in wetland, wet soil habitats, Kerry more than tripled the number of records that we had. So there was even though it may look like small numbers, it was significant compared to the number of records that we had within the database. And then finally, Frank Ashwood led on a research paper, which included myself and others, analysing 14,000 records from the Earthworm CITES database, and that included Irish data, looking at the research biases so that we could, and habitat and microhabitat associations, so that we could say some things from the data about the species that we've got occurring across the British Isles. And this paper was really useful for me in looking at things like habitat specificity or where things might be under-recorded. So here you can see from Frank's paper how well represented different species were in research data versus recorder data. And I'll come back to that a bit later. Here, Frank looked at the associations or the amount of data that you had based on specific site and sampling method combinations. And we can see that farmland, and particularly farmland soil pit and vermifuge, which is also sampling of the soil, is really well represented within the research data set. Whereas when we look at the recorder data set, there's a lot more purple there. There's a lot more variety. The recorders were covering a wider range of those combinations. And when we looked specifically, brought them down by species and looked at which species were found using which sampling methods or in which habitat types, again, we got more information about why we might have a lack of data for certain species. So, for example, if we go back to that example of Helodrillus oculatus, we can see here that it's never been found on farmland. So it's automatically going to look really rare in the Natural England report that was done in 2014, because its habitat that it's found in, which is predominantly wetland, is hugely under-recorded in that data set. Okay, so that brings me to my project and what I was working on. So Natural England were keen to do a red list, IUCN red listing exercise for the British Earthworms. But under consultation with me, we chatted about what data is available and the level of surveying that's been done in the UK. And the concern was that most of the species, if not all, would come out as data deficient. And that would lead we'd be no further along in understanding the conservation status assessment of UK earthworms. So what Natural England suggested is, rather than doing a formal red listing assessment, what we do is something that they're trialing called a provisional conservation status assessment. So it uses the same terminology as the IUCN red listing, so extinct, critically endangered, etc. But rather than doing the full statistical numerical assessment, it uses the expertise of a specialist, so in this case me, looking at earthworms, and whatever data or information we've got out there to assign a provisional conservation status assessment. So these provisional conservation status assessments, we're very aware, whatever category we come up with for things, there is a high chance that that might need correcting in the future. It's essentially a best guess based on the data that we've got. And I'm just going to walk you through what I did for that, for earthworms, and some of the things that it highlighted that we can look at in the future for addressing some of the problems with the data, so that we can actually look towards doing formal red list assessments in the future. So I took my information from a number of sources. I will, again, another caveat I'll put in is there is a finite amount of time, resource, capacity for this project. So there are definitely big limitations in there. I used quite heavily Sims and Gerard's Earthworm synopsis, which was published in 1999 by the Linnaean Society. I use that to get a lot of historic information on where earthworms have been found in habitat associations for species within the UK and a little bit further afield. I use the current taxonomy of the key to the earthworms of the UK and Ireland from Emma Sherlock that was published back in 2018. And I also had a look at any comments that Emma had made about habitats or ecology. I also leaned heavily on Earthworms in England, the Natural England report I mentioned, and particularly looking at the work that David had done on habitat specificity, population size, rarity, and where I was changing something, I made notes about why I had done that. I have Earthworm Society data, and I'll come to how much we had for the purpose of that. But even in writing it up, I've been able to use that a number of different scientific research papers. In particular, I used the one that I talked about from Frank, so the reference is going in the chat now, Earthworm Records and Habitat Associations in the British Isles. And there was a couple of studies from the French that were really useful that kind of change the status quo about what we say in terms of ecology and functional groups with our earthworms, because we've actually been kind of misrepresenting where they fit. So there's a number of recent studies that show that we should be careful about what we're saying about. And then finally, I use GBIF data to look at where our species fit globally. Now, there are huge limitations in that data because it relies on other countries submitting their data. And I would say one of the things that I would say from this exercise is that I realize how good we are in the UK for earthworm data compared to a lot of other territories. And we're definitely, if not, we may even be the best at sharing our data, because all Earthworm Society data for the UK, Ireland, Isle of Man and Channel Islands makes its way to GBIF where it's freely available. And there's definitely an exercise for UK and Ireland to try and encourage more submission of data from other non-UK and Irish territories, so that we can establish which species are endemic, native, etc., non-native. That was something that was really difficult. So what data did I use? What did I have? So for the British Isles, the assessment was specifically for the UK and Ireland. We didn't use the Irish data for the assessment, but I did use it for looking at things like habitat specificity and looking at global distribution of species. So we had 22,263 records. That's spread across 3 data sets: the National Earthworm Recording Scheme records, our Earthworm research records, and also a data set from the Environment Agency, which specifically only records Icynella tetrahedra. And that's because it's from their kick sampling data that they get across England, and they only record that species to species level. Any other earthworm that they find, they just record as Lumbricidae earthworm to family level. You can see that the distribution across different UK territories is not even. It's heavily biased towards England. That's because of biases in the research data, biases in the recording data, and that Environment Agency data set. So yeah, there are huge biases geographically within the UK there, and highlights the need for us to do more recording outside of England as well. But England is not particularly well covered either, if I'm going to be completely honest. So the different sections within the report, which hasn't been published yet, but it's getting closer. First of all, we looked at taxonomy and made sure that we had up-to-date taxonomy, put all the synonyms in, put in common names where possible, and talked about any taxonomic considerations. So there are definitely some species in there that are more than one species. So, for example, Aparetidea caliginosa is known to be a cryptic species. Work across Europe has shown that there are a number of different species within it. We don't know within the UK which of those species we have or don't have. They haven't been separated morphologically. We only know that they, through DNA work, that they're different. But there will be splits coming in the future, I would imagine. And so where possible, I've tried to point that out. Also, where we've got species that are really difficult to differentiate between them, I've noted that as well. I then made the odd comment about their ecology. And I leaned heavily on that paper from Bottinelli et al., the French paper, that says that traditionally earthworms are grouped into one of three categories: endogeic, anesic, or epigeic. The truth is that it's more complicated than that. So I want to start moving us away in the UK from being so prescriptive, because I don't think it's helpful, because that's not how the earthworms behave. So I'll be looking to put in a wider range of ecological categories, and I'll also be looking to put in functional groups based on their bioturbation behavior. So this diagram is from a paper that was released by Kapowitz et al. Earlier this year, that introduces functional groups based on observed behavior in laboratory conditions. Now, having a look at where they've categorized species according to this, I believe that there are still changes that need to be made, and they themselves have said there are limitations within their study. There are species within the UK that were not included within this study, so there are species that we won't have this evidence for as well. So there's going to be more and more evidence gaps coming out from this research, from this report. I took the data that we had and I tried to get some ways of quantitatively looking at how we might draw parallels that you would get from much more in-depth statistical analysis through the IUCN Red Listing criteria. So as an example, I looked at the total number of UK records to get kind of a measure of how well recorded something is. I looked at the percentage of UK records that any given species accounted for. And for a measure of geographic spread, I tried to look, it's a really, really rough measure, but I looked at the number of UK vice counties it was recorded in, because we know there are big gaps in recording across the UK. So I wanted something that was just really broad brush, so to help kind of limit the impact of under recording in the analysis. So a diagram like this, a figure like this, is being generated for every species. And I also tried to look at the general distribution as well, so just by eye, to see if there look like there are any obvious patterns. But bearing in mind what I said earlier, there are going to be huge limitations to this, and there are going to be, as we get more information, we're going to be recategorizing species accordingly. So UK distribution, the kind of output that you would get would look like this. So I'd comment on the number of vice counties. I'd look at the distribution and come up with a broad brush description of what I could see. And from that, I would give it a category of either widely distributed, moderately distributed, restricted, or restricted distribution. I then move on to habitat specificity, and I'd look at what Natural England had done previously. I'd look at the information that was in Sims and Gerard, and I'd look at the analysis by Ashwood et al. And I'd come up with a habitat specificity assessment as well. So that would be low, moderate, high for those. It's worth noting that not all habitats are evenly recorded. Farmland still accounts for over a third. There are some, like heath and moorland and scrubland, that account for under 1% of the habitat records. So we need to be really careful with the conclusions that we draw. Wetland looks like it's well represented there, but that is purely because of the Icinella tetrahedra records. So actually, if you take them out, wetland is really underrepresented as well. And wetland specialists like Helodrillus oculatus are not going to show up in the data as much as they potentially should, because they were not actually assessed for in the majority of the wetland records, because it was just looking at Icinella tetrahedra. So I then wanted something that I could compare to the previous report. So I came up with a rarity value, and that was based on the distribution value, the habitat specificity value, and also based on what they said in the Natural England report from 2014 about abundance as well. So had a look at that, and rather than come up with common, rare, and extremely rare, like was done previously, I felt like we needed more of a scale. There were things that were coming up as rare that are definitely not rare. They're maybe not really common, but they're not really rare. And there are a couple of species that are really common, found in large numbers across many sites. And I felt like we needed a category to capture that as well. So I added in uncommon and very common, and I changed the terminology from extremely rare to very rare, just to match what we're saying about very common. And based on all of that, I gave each species a rarity value. In some cases, I would also add in some context personally. So where I know the habitat they're found in is really under-recorded. For example, species that might be found associated with synanthropic habitats, so habitats associated with humans, I might bump them down a bit to a bit more uncommon rather than rare, because I know of that. And then I also looked at the global context. So I'd look at the information on GBIF, but I'd also take into account the information in Sims and Gerard, because they quite often mention a load of countries that a species have been recorded in, and these wouldn't be showing up on GBIF. So I took that into account. I also made a note of which countries they were recorded as invasive in. And that was really interesting, because there was a lot of what I thought were European species that were noted as being invasive across Europe, or across random countries in Europe. And I think that might be to do with differences in how we determine whether something is invasive or not. And I think there's a lot of earthworms are listed as invasive species in countries where they're probably not invasive. Something else that came out was that all of our Lumbricidae species were listed as invasive in America, in the USA. And I think that some of them are just listed even though they may not have been recorded there. So there was there's a real need for us to reassess globally how we determine whether species are invasive or not. But really interesting at a UK level, we only had one species that was listed as non-native, and that was Sparganophilus tomesis. But we know that we have others. So Microscolex phosphorius is widely regarded as a non-native species. We know that that family originates from South America. It was possibly first recorded in the UK, that species, but that doesn't mean that it is native here. There are also two species, Bimastus icinium, Bimastus rubidus, which are registered as non-native invasive species in the USA and not over here. But taxonomical research, DNA research, has shown that that genus geographically belongs to North America. So they should be registered as non-native species here, even though they've probably been here for quite a while. And their registration as invasive species in the USA should probably be removed. And then there are a whole range of species that we have occurring in the UK that we don't really know what their native range is and whether that incorporates the UK. And I would find these comments in the 1999 Sims and Gerard's publication that would say, not native to the UK, unknown where native range is. So for now, I haven't recategorized them as non-native, but there's a place for some DNA work to assess where regionally these countries come from, looking at their genetics compared to other species across the UK, Europe, wider world, to see where we think biogeographically they come from. I then also looked at threats. Now, not a lot is known about threats to earthworms, specifically when thinking about things at a species level. So a lot of what I've had to look at is really making best guesses based on things like what habitats they're found in and what microhabitats. But some of the things that might come up are things like the New Zealand flatworm and other invasive flatworms that pose a threat to earthworms. Land management, even management of conservation sites designated for conservation, because we're not managing sites for earthworms. I've definitely seen sites that have quite rare earthworms dug up in order to put conservation measures in for vertebrates. This is why we need to get our earthworms properly assessed and get them proper conservation statuses. And where we've got really rare species that are limited to a small number of sites, we really need to think about development and specific habitat management practices that are going on that site. We heard from Craig in the talk earlier that the horrid groundweaver is limited to a few sites and they are constantly a threat from development. And we might have similar issues with really rare earthworms as well. So taking all that together and trying to add in some level of structure to it, I came up with a provisional conservation status. So you'll see I've used the IUCN terminology, but I've put a little p in front. And that little p means that it hasn't been through the same rigorous statistical analysis. So what did I get? Well, many of our earthworms came out, without a doubt, they'll be least concern. So even with the limited data that we've got, we can see that they're widespread, they're detected fairly regularly whenever we go and sample for them. And we've got the non-natives there as well. So those 4 species will be registered by the end of this year as non-native. We've then got 1 critically endangered, which has only been found at 1 site in the UK, although we're not entirely sure whether it's native or non-native. We've got 1 vulnerable, and we've got a number of near threatened. This is the first time we've ever not only looked at the rarity of species, but thought about what does that mean in terms of actions. So coming out of this, there will be a number of recommendations. Now, a lot of these are going to be about addressing data gaps because we still don't have enough information to properly assess these species. Some of it will be about doing DNA work, and that might be both nationally and internationally. And some of it will involve actually getting out there and looking for specific species. But there will be some conservation recommendations for some of our really rare species where they're and potentially linking to known sites. And there's more that's come out of that. Like, one thing I realized was we have very little live images of species of earthworms. So one of the interesting outputs that I wouldn't have foreseen coming from this is I now make more effort to photograph live earthworms because I realized that we didn't have photos of Isonella tetrahedra, the one on the right there, really common, small wet soil specialist. We don't, it's noted as being like purple or a brown color. I found it bright orange, but that's not noted anywhere. So we need to make more effort in general to record all aspects of earthworms. That photo in the middle might be one of the first ever live photos of Aporectidia limicola, a relatively rare species, but I've never seen pictures of it before. So this report has changed my opinion on, or raised awareness with me about what data we have and don't have. I look forward to publishing it. It will be made publicly available, and I'll